Okay, guys, welcome back to another edition, another episode of Rotten Reviews. On this edition, I am going to look at Star Trek Nemesis from 2002, and we have a tomato meter score of 37% and an audience score of 49%. This movie is certainly rotten, and what a way to end the Star Trek Next Generation franchise, going out completely rotten, completely boring. And as a longtime Star Trek fan, I couldn't even remember what happened in this film until I refreshed myself by reading some other reviews. I'm not going to put myself through watching this again to try to find nuggets of wisdom. The only nugget of wisdom I have here is that Star Trek The Next Generation should have been allowed to end on its season finale episode called All Good Things. That was the proper ending. This was like trying to bring it back from the dead and take a dump on it. As in the case with the first Star Trek The Next Generation movie called Star Trek Generations, where they summarily killed off the iconic character of Captain Kirk, just brushed him off their shoulder with no relevancy. They did the same thing with the character of Data in this movie. They killed him off pointlessly, with plenty of plot holes to go along with this. And then the crew itself just simply brushed him off and went on as though, just another day we got rid of Data. And yet they didn't really get rid of Data. They brought back one of his android forms, B4, literally called B4, as a device to say, well, Data's programming isn't completely lost. But yeah, they just brushed him off like they brushed Kirk off with Generations. And it's sad to see the Next Generation storyline end here because, again, it's mostly just boring and forgettable. But when you get back into it, when you're refreshed on what was wrong with this movie, you find that it had plenty of plot holes. It was just an insult right off the bat when part of the main storyline is that the Romulans were developing a clone of Jean-Luc Picard, who they summarily dismissed and tried to dispose of. This clone takes over what's left of the Roman or Romulan Empire and is the villain of this movie. But see, the thing that's in your face is this clone is played by an actor that looks nothing like Patrick Stewart. So even though they kind of make him up bald and put a dimple on his chin, Tom Hardy is the actor. Since he doesn't look like Patrick Stewart, you're wondering right off the bat, how can this be a clone? Why does Patrick Stewart think this is a clone of him? Because, see, in the storyline of this film, he right away recognizes that this is a clone of him, and so do all the other characters. Yet he doesn't look like Patrick Stewart, so I don't get it. I don't get why they cast somebody into a role that's, supposed to look like somebody, but they don't. It makes no sense. It's very off-putting to me right away when I watched this, and I remember it being off-putting to me when I first saw this movie with an open mind. It just gets worse with age, this film does. The more you look into it, the more plot holes you find, and it is completely boring. And what did this accomplish? Again, I say they should have just let the series go out on its final episode. It would have been far better. This doesn't even make the cut for an episode of TNG. It would have been an episode that would have been the worst of any season. If this is how the final episode of TNG ended, like a TV episode version of this story, it would have been unforgivable. With this, it's forgivable because you can just forget this movie exists and just enjoy the show. So let's move on into the audience reviews. We have the first one, October 18th of 2019, 4.5 stars, a hell of an ending to a series. I don't know what series they're talking about. It wasn't the Star Trek The Next Generation series. Again, I'm a long-term fan, lifelong fan of Star Trek. The only series I didn't really appreciate was the one with Scott Bakula, Star Trek, I believe it was called Enterprise. It had its ups and downs. It had a few good episodes. It certainly ended with a lot of good episodes, but it was canceled before it could reach its 7-year-long run. This one, this is worse. Nemesis is worse. The average Star Trek Enterprise episode is better than this, much less Next Generation. Half a star. What an awful idea for a Star Trek movie, conjuring up a supervillain to attempt to reach the highs of Khan from the original without actually laying the groundwork. This is the template for why Discovery turned out to be a catastrophe. Writers and directors who don't actually understand Star Trek are put in charge of the helm and they steer into an iceberg. What a horrendous way to end the next gen story. I just pretend this calamity was a bad Picard nightmare. Exactly, just pretend like it ended with the actual season finale. That's satisfying. 4.5 stars. A plot and special effects piece of Star Trek that has been rated and watched over and over by fans as a solid entry in the next generation timeline. Really, that must be a review from the alternate universe in which this was considered the peak of the next generation movies. It's not in this timeline. 2 stars, a terrible plot but decent action. 1 star, it's as if the worst possible, repeatedly rejected two-part script for TNG was made by an overly ambitious group of woefully under-crowdfunded Trekkies in name only, who convinced Paramount to market it as a genuine Star Trek movie. But worse, way, way worse. You know, I agree 100% with that. That's exactly what this seems like. 5 stars. Very underrated movie. I absolutely loved it. I am sad that others didn't give it a chance. I don't know where that's coming from. Even somebody that could speak about the few good things on this, 5 stars, really? This, like a lot of reviewers, they seem to think that if a movie is unfairly, in their view, critiqued and given a low amount of stars, it's their moral prerogative. It's their duty to come in here and slap 5 stars on it to try to counterbalance that. So I dismiss it 100%. 4 stars, 79 out of 100. Star Trek Nemesis has a pretty good script, but it's quite stupid in some areas. The ideas, again, are really well presented and thought about, but the execution of the script and dialogue and just the overall logical structure of the events happening are mediocre at best. Yeah, they're complete crap. Continuing, still the characters, the visual effects, and the action sequences were good. Tom Hardy gave a really good performance next to Patrick Stewart. Star Trek Nemesis, although it tries, never reaches the heights. Well, it sounds like a professional critic writing this on his off time, trying to talk this up to get access to something at Paramount, because no, I disagree completely. Tom Hardy looks ridiculous next to Patrick Stewart, especially as his clone. Maybe if you had said they were fraternal twins or something, okay, yeah, they're not supposed to look the same, but this is supposed to be his clone, and it's Tom Hardy. I don't know what they were thinking here. It's complete nonsense. 5 stars. I must say I'm rather disappointed in the lackluster or outright poor reviews of Nemesis. It was one of my favorites. Picking an absolute favorite is difficult when you factor in Generations and Insurrection. Yeah, those weren't good either. While the film did not have as much drama as it did action sequences, I feel that is what Nemesis has going for it. What do you do when you are faced with an enemy that is far bigger than you, is faster than you, many times more powerful, that hates everything about you? I don't know what movie they're talking about. You know, they actually shoehorned in a kind of Fast and Furious style action sequence into the beginning of this film, putting the characters of Picard and Data and etc. on the surface of a planet and having them do stunts with a dune buggy type thing. That's action, sure, but what does it have to do with Star Trek? And it's like not what we needed to waste footage on in a Star Trek movie. I don't get where people come from that they're going to say that this enemy is far bigger, far more powerful. No, actually, the enemy, the logic of the story is convincing me that the enemy is actually not too smart. In the plot of this movie, Data's a clone, you know, one of Data's prior models called B4, his head is placed on a planet for, you know, the Enterprise crew to find, to draw them into a mystery, to suck them into the plot. And that's a plot device used by the villain, and it's again nonsensical. Some super bad villain, this Tom Hardy villain, he's gonna, you know, have all this super genius plotting stuff going on, and yet that's the lame thing that he does at the beginning to get them to fall into his trap. This is complete nonsense. I don't know what they were trying to do here. Half a star. The Next Generation crew was never as good as the original. Patrick Stewart is not in the same league as William Shatner. Brett Spiner is not in the same league as Leonard Nimoy. This film proves the point. Romulans are some of the most boring villains in Star Trek. Yeah, I'd say the Romulans are boring villains because they were never, nobody ever did anything with them properly. In the Next Generation, the Romulans are kind of portrayed at their most interesting as like a Cold War type villain. And it works, and they're portrayed like that in Deep Space Nine as a Cold War type adversary. That's all there is to them. They're not the Star Trek franchise doesn't do anything with Romulans beyond that point. Now in this one, it almost tries to make a parallel with the collapse of the Soviet Union and say that there's this Romulan supervillain that wants the Empire to live on, but yet he's also a clone of Picard. It's got several things going on here that don't really seem to fit together. And again, it's trying to make the Romulans into a Cold War villain. And the Cold War is over, and the Romulans, we've never seen them used for anything else. So that's why they come across as most boring here. They're always kind of boring if you take away the Cold War aspects to how they were presented. In the original series, you know, I've seen documentaries on this. The Romulans were kind of like a budget constraint. They needed to come up with some kind of alien adversary, but you know they had already the costuming and everything for the Vulcans, so it was easy for them to just modify Vulcans and call them Romulans. But later in TNG, they were more properly fleshed out as a Cold War type villain. But yeah, there's nothing else to them, so yeah, they're boring by today's standards. We're still in 2019 on the reviews. Half a star, okay, I accept half a star. Again, I'll say this could be 1 star. I don't know if I said that at the beginning, but I'm judging this at 1 star. 3 stars, kind of liked it, but it should have been more. Wow, you're way too kind. I'm a Star Trek fan. I'm not going to give this mercy. As a standalone film, it wouldn't make any sense anyway, so I'm not going to give you my rating based on what I thought this would be as just a standalone sci-fi film, because none of this makes any sense as a standalone sci-fi film. It only makes sense in the context of Star Trek. Therefore, I'm only judging it as a Star Trek fan. Therefore, 1 star, peaking at 1 star. 2.5 stars. Here's the kiss goodbye from the TNG ensemble, although perhaps less than a kiss and more of a postcard. And so we are led through this roadside museum, cafe, diner dedicated to the good old days, where nods are half-heartedly made to all the familiar and recognizable tropes of the television show, and all the nourishment offered is kind of old and lukewarm. Ho-hum, warp out of here. Yeah, exactly. Completely boring. It's a Star Trek film that doesn't really give you any emotional feel. It doesn't give you a point. It closes out the TNG universe without leaving it on any kind of message at all. It's completely boring. I forgot most of it, like I said, until I just skimmed over some of these reviews. 1.5 stars. The fact that they had Data kill himself basically after all these years from the original series trying to learn more about humanity and wanting to embrace change, as Picard put it to be for, it seems like a pointless cop-out for the character. And now with the new series coming out starring Patrick Stewart, it's supposed to pick up where the end of Nemesis left off. Yeah, that's kind of a bad omen, isn't it? Say what you will about Star Trek since this movie, but the plan as of now in 2019 is to have a series continue on from the end of Nemesis with Patrick Stewart and perhaps with Brent Spiner in some role. And yeah, this kind of, if it starts here, this is a bad start to it. It doesn't give anybody a good feeling about what we're about to see. 3 stars. It's not bad, but it suffers from a director who didn't know what Star Trek was and had no experience with the material or the cast. The story is typical Star Trek, but is slow to get its feet moving. It never does get moving. 5 stars. Underrated. Tom Hardy is superb, as is the Next Gen cast. The scene of the Enterprise ramming Shinzon's ship is one of the greatest scenes I've ever seen in any sci-fi film. It's utterly spectacular. Love this movie. Deserves more love than it gets. I completely disagree. In fact, that's a major plot hole. Yes, the Enterprise decides to ram the bad guy's ship, but this is like a very drawn out, slow thing that's happening. All the bad guy had to do was reverse or get out of the way, but he doesn't. A plot hole, and it's really dumb. Like, what's the point of this? So thanks for reminding me of that. 4.5 stars. After watching the other two Star Trek movies and being fairly disappointed, I decided to give this third one a try. Three times the charm, this movie was much better. No, this gets worse with each viewing. Maybe each time you imbibe some like hallucinogenic substances until finally you reach the right blood chemical balance that this was enjoyable. Otherwise, this is worse on each viewing if you can even get through it on the second viewing. 2 stars. Should have been better than it was. Definitely not as strong writing as previous films. Although I like Tom Hardy, I heard James Marsters was also up for the part, and some cast members wanted him. I have to agree, Marsters would have done a better job than this young Tom Hardy. Well, yeah, that's possible because this Tom Hardy clone character did look like kind of a Nosferatu vampire. Marsters is known for playing a vampire in Buffy and Angel. So yeah, it might have worked, but again, could we make this a vampire flick? It might have been at least funny, I guess. 3 stars. It's okay, but the action is overblown. The enemy ship makes no sense, and the course the story takes is broken and twisted. It's more like a part of the JJ reboot than the original and next-gen Star Trek. Yeah, don't put the JJ reboot 2009 Star Trek in with this. That movie's far superior to this. That movie actually keeps you entertained. Nitpick it all you want. Don't like JJ. Call him Jar Jar Abrams. Whatever you want to do, but just take my word for it. The Star Trek soft reboot from JJ Abrams is far more entertaining than this. 5 stars. A very underrated film. It's an elegant story that deftly parallels the journeys of Picard and Shinzon with that of Data and B4. Stewart, Spiner, and Hardy are at their best here, and the final scene between Picard and B4 always brings a lump to my throat. You're reading a lot into this that wasn't there. Okay, you're bringing your nostalgia from Next Gen into this. It should have been left on, the final episode called All Good Things. That has an emotional impact. This is simply nothing. It gives you nothing. I feel nothing from this. 3.5 stars. Despite it being a little longer and slower than it needed to be, this was a decent enough conclusion to the 4-film series featuring the Next Generation crew. Not the most thrilling plot, but it went out fairly satisfying at the end. Wow, you could sleep through half of it and you're going to reach the same conclusion. If you got a satisfying sleep out of it, okay. 0.5 star, ugh, just a waste and a terrible way to end the series. Agree 100%. 5 stars, imperfect but underrated. Yeah, so you'll have to give it 5 stars to like tip the balance, right? Okay. 2.5 stars, characters are great as usual, but this is just kind of boring. Yeah, exactly. 2.5 stars, this was not the best note to end the original series. Yes. 2 stars, underwhelming Star Trek movie. Give Next Gen a poor ending. Yes. 3 stars, more of an action tone in this film. While it's supposed to be a final send-off for the cast, it is more of a demo for the future J.J. Abrams-style movies. It is one of those movies that boosts the frame rate to make the runtime shorter and quicken the pace, at least in the version I watched. I really hate that. Well, that could be true if you saw this on a cable channel because they do that. They'll actually speed up the frame rate to put more commercials in. But no, that's not the way the original movie was. 1.5 stars, a truly terrible way to end the TNG films, excessively contrived and forced. There is no romance, rhyme, or reason to this truly disappointing effort. Yes, I agree. 2.5 stars, watchable, that's about it though. 3 stars, we finally get a movie with Romulans and the baddies aren't even Romulans. There is a fun movie with cool ships, and while most of it works, the entire reason for the conflict is forced. It's sad that this is the last outing for the TNG cast. They deserved another chance. Yes, I'll agree with this. The Romulans were never characterized beyond just like a Cold War type villain. Again, the neutral zone, East-West Germany type vibe, watchtowers, looking at watchtowers. This was the Romulans. This is what they were used for in Star Trek. It worked, I thought, the best in Deep Space Nine, no question about it. It worked fantastically in Deep Space Nine. But here, it's just like they're cardboard cutouts. And again, we're not even dealing with Romulans. We're dealing with the Remans, kind of like the the downtrodden underclass of the Romulan Empire. That's not even fleshed out either. So although we do know from previous Star Trek canon that Remus is part of the Romulan star system, we don't know anything about them or why they're different or why they're the same or why they're caught up in the politics with the Romulans. Again, it's all just cardboard kind of put together. So I'll agree in that regard. 5 stars, the most underrated Star Trek film of all time. After all the great movies that the series produced, I can't help but think people have been spoiled. This movie is far greater than anything they produced in 2018, and it's very creative with set and ship designs. As usual, Patrick Stewart and the crew deliver great acting performances. Well, this sounds like somebody that's just come off of watching like Star Trek Discovery, the first and second seasons, and then they're watching this and they're saying, hey, this is a lot better. That's a matter of taste. I've met people, particularly younger millennials, that much prefer Star Trek Discovery over this. I don't know. I haven't seen Star Trek Discovery, so I can't honestly say. That's up to maybe a future Rotten review if I get into it. But no, don't excuse this because like maybe Discovery wasn't your cup of tea. This is bad. Next Generation, it's bad. 2.5 stars. A promising story and terrific visuals are wasted by bad dialogue and awful storytelling. Yeah, I'll agree. The story was promising, and then as soon as we were introduced to the Shinzon character, who was a clone and yet didn't look like Picard, it was all downhill from there. 3 stars. Nemesis isn't as bad as many people seem to think. Tom Hardy is crazy fun. There's some Star Trek philosophizing going on. The action is fast-paced. Still, with its forgettable plotting, it's a mildly disappointing send-off for the next-gen crew. You're way too soft on this. Get some real emotion, because that's just like kid gloving this thing all the way. 4 stars. Good movie, but with weakness, but more than Star Trek 9. I don't know what you mean, but 4 stars, no way. This is 1 star. 2.5 stars, much like TMP. I guess they're saying the motion picture. I can see where this was an interesting idea in Nemesis with Picard and Shinzon's nature versus nurture philosophical battle, but it isn't given enough time to be fully fleshed out and forces too much action for an aging cast. The Data B4 storyline was also interesting in concept, but wound up just being a way to toss in an easy cop-out to the movie's supposedly emotional finale. I largely agree with this. The problem I have with Data and B4, just the name B4, it's too on the nose. It's almost like something that J.J. Abrams did in the Star Wars movies, or something Lucas did too. Name something in a way that after a short amount of time you can tell it's poking fun of itself. B4, like you get the joke. This was a model of Data that came before. This is completely dumb. I mean, that's not this movie's fault. B4 was a thing in TNG before this movie. It's the worst thing to put into this movie if you want the movie to be taken seriously, though. You would rather see Lore. Okay, at least Lore was less cringy than this. B4, it was just bad. 1 star. Another weak movie. Picard meets a clone of himself who has a plan for revenge. Could have worked as another episode in the TV series. Patrick Stewart is completely wasted in this role. The film again suffers from poorly written script, weak storylines, plot holes, and a loss of character integrity. Yeah, I'll agree. I'll agree with that. 2 stars. Doesn't live up to the legacy, yes. 2 stars. Worst Star Trek film in my opinion. Considering that I can't really recall anything good at all about, resurrection or insurrection, excuse me. Yeah, that's debatable. We're going to take a look at insurrection and see just how bad that is, because there's a big blank spot in my memory on that, and there's probably a reason for that. 2.5 stars. Not the worst of the TNG movies, but another film that just felt like an extension of the TV show. Yeah, an extension of the show that should have been cut from the show. 5 stars. I think it was pretty awesome, even that has some issues. I am fine with Data's death, considering Spiner is so disgusting and hated every second of him playing Data. Pretty shitty movie, considering it's the biggest role he has ever done, and probably put food on his mouth even to this day. It would be nice to see a reboot with an actor that would love to be Data. Yeah, Data's very cringeworthy in more than one of the Star Trek Next Gen movies. It didn't come across that way in the TV show, because the TV show had subplots that were lighter hearted. and they worked at, because the show was basically TNG, the show. It always had a main plot and then a subplot, a parallel subplot often. And it worked as Data being the comic relief and having the comedy in the subplot. But as a standalone movie, it's just off-putting and cringy. Only in I accept some of that in Star Trek First Contact. I think Star Trek First Contact was fantastic with Data trying to do some of his cringy humor, but it wasn't, it worked in that movie. It doesn't work in all the other Star Trek films. It's just cringy. 4 stars, good movie. Don't understand why it was panned by critics. The relationship between Picard and Shinzon raises some interesting questions about what makes us who we are. Both genetically identical, but their paths and the decisions they made were so different. We don't buy the fact that they're genetically the same because they don't look the same. Why does Picard look like Patrick Stewart and yet Shinzon looks like Tom Hardy with a bald head? I'm sorry, but that kind of takes away the whole genetically identical thing. Like, again, if you wanted to say they were fraternal brothers or something about them wasn't identical, but no, you're saying he's a clone. So what in Shinzon's upbringing as a clone makes him look completely different than Patrick Stewart? Explain this, please. It's not explained. 2.5 stars. With consistently great acting and an inconsistent story, Nemesis is good but not great. The main cast gives strong performances as usual. Tom Hardy is terrific as Shinzon. The practical and special effects are fantastic by 2002 standards and pretty good by today's standards, and the action is great. Unfortunately, the scenes between the action often borderline on boring, and the cast can't completely save the film from iffy writing and poor pacing. Problem is, I disagree with strong performances. What strong performances? The characters are like cardboard cutouts of themselves. No. I'm just going to say no. 1.5 stars. Star Trek Nemesis was officially the straw that broke the camel's back for me. I've been trying my best to give these next generation movies a shot as I watched through the entire series, but at this point I simply do not care. This review is from 2017, by the way. Continuing, I was mentally checked out as I tried to suffer through this stupid movie. There were a number of action scenes and I was yawning with boredom. I almost gave up but wanted to finish just so I could say I've seen all these terrible films. I almost can't work up the willpower to write an actual review. You know what? I kind of like almost completely agree with this reviewer. I'm a complete lifelong Star Trek fan, and if I had to sit through all of the next-gen movies again in 2019, I'd probably have a lower opinion of Star Trek, and that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. 1.5 stars. This was a very disappointing send-off to the Next Generation cast. The premise is not bad, but did not hold my attention. 2.8 out of 10. 4 stars. 4 stars just because Data died, just because the actor is full of shit. The character should not suffer or die because he hates it. The only thing that makes him famous. Yeah, I kind of agree. Brett Spiner just rubs people the wrong way in these movies, with the exception of First Contact. You kind of want to see him blowing out the airlock in a way. But again, it's off-putting that you see these characters at the end of this movie kind of brush off his death like it's no big deal. It doesn't work. 3 stars. This was not as bad as everyone said. Underrated in my opinion. The acting is good. The villain is also pretty well done. No, wow, I don't know what movie you're watching. 2.5 stars. Interesting ideas, but just plain boring, I agree. 3 stars. The strength of the TNG series has always been the cast, and this movie is no different. I enjoyed this one. No, the cast showed up and they got paid. But no, I consider the strength of the characters of the original cast of TNG in that they actually did their jobs. They performed their parts episode to episode. They actually made you feel something. They don't in this movie. 2 stars. It's beautiful to look at, and the action scenes were interesting. But I think all this movie did was piss off a bunch of Trekkies. Screw you. Yes, it does piss off a bunch of Trekkies. If I spent too much time on this, I would get pissed off, so I'm not going to. 4 stars. Highly entertaining movie that finally gives us a look at the Remans, a species largely overlooked throughout the franchise. The battle at the climax of the movie is particularly enjoyable. It gives you a look at what their makeup looks like. That obviously they're not genetically related to the Romulans. But but otherwise, they're still cardboard villains. No, we don't really understand anything about them. 1 star, uninteresting and underdeveloped. 3.5 stars, not as bad as all that, still quite bad, too long, it was some terrible plot points, but in retrospect it had its moments. I don't know what moments those were, it's completely forgettable to me. 49% audience score, as a Star Trek fan, deserves to be 29%. I don't see these scores changing anytime soon. I could see them, like sinking down a little more on the audience score over the next several years, but they aren't going to go up. This does not go up. I don't care how bad the next season of Star Trek Discovery is. I don't care if the next Patrick Stewart Star Trek show bombs hard on in the first 10 minutes. This score is not going up. There's no way. The score will continue to sink. I look forward to seeing it sink, actually. We'll check back on it, assuming Rotten Tomatoes is still around. And I'll leave it on that note and say goodbye until the next episode of Rotten Reviews.